Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Over the past several weeks, we've been taking a deep dive into the topic of intelligent design, which at its core is a response against evolution. In this sense, then, it's a form of science denial, even though much of their points and counter-arguments can be very scientific in nature. And to help our audience evaluate the various claims that ID advocates and opponents make, Scott and I have included quite a bit of background information on how genes and proteins work, how cellular machines work, and even how evolution works. This then would be a form of science education. We've often tackled examples of science denial in the past. Denial of climate change in episode 67, denials around COVID in many episodes, 28 and 36 and a few in the 60s there, and opposition to evolution again in episodes 69 to 81, as well as examples of pseudoscience. The ivermectin and hydrochloroquine stories come to mind here in episode number 61. And we felt all those episodes and others were necessary because, unfortunately, science denial and pseudoscience run rampant within evangelical circles.
Yeah, it's interesting. Polling agencies like Pew and Gallup, for example, frequently probe the extent to which Christians in general and evangelicals in particular shun science and embrace pseudosciences. I think COVID brought a lot of this to the foreground. During the COVID crisis, there was a tremendous skepticism of science on the part of evangelicals. And, you know, some of that, there's such thing as a healthy skepticism. You know, it's okay to question. So when the vaccines came out, people have a right to take care of their own health, and it's okay to question things about that. But then it goes kind of beyond that when you start to get into kind of irrational questioning.
Exactly.
You know? And you're talking then conspiracy theories and these kinds of things. And there seems to be a susceptibility to that within the evangelical community, and maybe even generally in the religious community broadly as well. Yeah.
And I was going to say, you mentioned that the COVID pandemic really brought this out. The polling agencies were really showing some substantial differences between evangelicals and other demographic subgroups. But they were also asking the Christian community, and with focus on the evangelicals, scientific questions for decades now. The origin of humans, the age of the earth, old versus young. So they've been tracking the pullout of evangelicals, of Christians in general, and evangelicals in particular, the pullout from science for quite a while.
Yeah. And this has fairly deep roots. I mean, there is this quote, and I put it in air quotes because there's a lot of dispute whether this is really a valid historical category, but this idea, at least, of the warfare of science and faith, right? It goes back to at least the 18th century. But well, even before that, of course, you have Galileo and the affair with the Catholic Church and so on. So of course, that's not evangelicals, but there's an uneasy relationship, I think, between those who look at the world strictly empirically and those who have a different understanding. So, and it's obviously not a trivial topic because when you have a crisis like COVID, for example, lives are literally on the line. I happen to know somebody personally, of somebody that I worked for, that died during the crisis because they refused to take a vaccine. You know, that's just, to me, very, very sad. And it's an important topic.
Yes, and many authors and podcasters and organizations have stepped forward with the primary mission of trying to raise scientific literacy and education among evangelicals. Today we're going to talk to an author who has recently made one of her latest contributions to this effort. Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray, who holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction with 18 years of teaching biology at the university level, and has just released her second book, The God of Monkey Science, People of Faith in a Modern Scientific World. Welcome to our podcast, Janet.
Thanks, guys. I'm so happy to be here.
Welcome. And I was just wondering about your actual biology background. So your PhD is in education, I guess. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
My undergrad is biology.
Okay.
I initially was a middle school science teacher.
Okay.
My master's and my PhD were both in areas of education, but with that science education focus on there.
Right.
So I've been at University of North Texas for about to finish up my 18th year. I've taught majors and non-majors and love it.
Great.
Excellent. Now, Janet, probably the first question on everyone's lips is, what's with the title, The God of Monkey Science? What's that about?
Well, backing up just a little bit, I was raised in a family and a church tradition in which we took the Bible very seriously and absolutely literally. And I actually never remember evolution or science being denigrated from the pulpit because young earth creationism was just the default position. We would have have questioned the literalness of Genesis than we would have questioned the existence of Jesus. But fast forward to my own middle school years, and believe it or not, in Texas in the 1970s, science was an elective and not required for 7th grade. And I wanted to take choir because I thought it sounded fun. But my dad was a teacher at that school, and he insisted, he signed me up for science. And I credit him to this day for changing the trajectory of my life. It was an amazing science class for 7th grade, a very progressive, very experimental school. And I definitely remember as we went through the animal kingdom, as we called it, doing all the dissections, that number one, these things were animals. And in my experience, animals were puppies and kitties and sheep and goats, those kind of things. But what I was seeing across this diverse spectrum of animals was that these animals appeared to be connected in some way. It was almost like there were systems that were being reworked, remodeled. And now I had absolutely no vocabulary to express that at the time.
And again, this is grade 7.
Yes, grade 7. It was an amazing class for grade 7. And we did real dissections in those days.
Wow.
And so I remember just thinking, this looks awfully connected. This looks like everything is related somehow, but I had absolutely no vocabulary, nor would I have expressed that at the time. On into high school, some of the same thoughts. I went to a Christian university, which I loved and still love. I was a biology major there and still had some of those same thoughts. But by then I'd learned just to silo those thoughts off and think, if I just close one eye and squint, can I make the fossil record match the days of creation? Graduated. Yep. And my husband and I were both biology majors, graduated. We both had the same freshman biology intro class. And I distinctly remember the professor who ended up being my favorite biology professor. I ended up teaching labs for him later on, made the comment, here is evolution in the textbook. You need to know it. And that was it for 2 biology majors. So, fast forward a few years later, we're young adults, and we heard about a horrible situation that happened at our alma mater. A young earth creationist who had no connection to our school came in and tried to absolutely devastate the careers of 2 of the biology professors because they were teaching about evolution. Well, one was a tough old guy and he withstood the storm, but the other one was my favorite professor, and it devastated him. I was able a couple of years ago to talk to a professor who was on faculty at the time. And he said the ironic thing was that this guy was so religiously conservative, he squeaked, but he was humiliated by the attention. And unfortunately, he resigned and passed away only a few years later, a broken man. Oh. And so my husband and I, we brought these thoughts we'd been having that we had no vocabulary for. And that just began our own journey of reading and discovery and listening. And, I went to graduate school. He finished his medical training, and just the rest is history. So I wrote a book a couple of years ago that was about evolution denial by religious people. And that book was about to be published, the last few final edits, the things you have to do on the journey to publication, when COVID was in its middle year. We didn't know it at the time, but we were in year 2 of what ended up being about a 3-year ordeal. And I was in a chat room, so to speak, and someone had mentioned that the state of Texas, the governor, had dropped the mask mandate. Well, at this point, only the vaccine had just been released, and the vaccination rates for the state of Texas were still in single digits. And so, I think I said something about, everyone get their vaccines, go ribosomes, something science nerdy like that. And as it is when you write things for other people to read, someone may disagree with you. And a comment was made about my statement. There she goes again, Janet and her monkey god science. Now, I really wasn't offended. I knew this person was anti-vax, but the monkey god science was obviously a reference to the writing and the speaking that I do about evolution. Right. And so I was immediately perplexed. What does evolution have to do with public health and vaccination and Christian response to a pandemic? And so that's where I fell down my second rabbit hole of investigating science denial in general. And apparently what I found was this denial playbook, so to speak. It wasn't just evolution, but what you found were the voices that were speaking against evolution were the same voices that were speaking against human involvement in climate warming and any kind of response to the science behind the pandemic. And so that how the title came, The God of Monkey Science. It came from a comment of Janet and her monkey god science.
Okay. And we're going to unpack it in detail, but maybe start us off with just your elevator pitch for the book. What's in a couple sentences? What is it about?
Well, I would say that, evolution was the first science that offended Christians, particularly those in evangelical precincts. And in fighting evolution for so long, for decades, evangelicals just developed an entire way of talking about science. And we took those anti-evolution arguments and we retooled them and we relaunched them to serve another day in response to any area of modern science that did not fit into an evangelical worldview.
We interviewed Nick Matsky a few weeks ago, and we may bring him on. In fact, I'm considering bringing him on to talk about this, which is he did a phylogenetic study. Phylogeny is, again, just you follow how animals evolve from one form into another. It's a family tree, essentially. You generate a family tree, a tree of life. But he did that for the arguments against evolution in favor of intelligent design, and he mapped out this whole phylogenetic tree. It's really interesting. Fun fact. Okay. But just to tie up one last loose end, you said that this book we're going to talk about now is your second one. You made a reference to having written one, and it was about to come out during the COVID break. That then was Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
The Bible and modern science and the trouble of making it all fit. Yep. And again, in the sentence or two, what is that about?
That Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark became a metaphor for me as I was writing that book for all of the ways we try to force fit science into scripture and scripture into science. If we have a problem getting all these gigantosaurs on Noah's Ark, well, they were baby dinosaurs on the Ark. And we do all of these mental gymnastics in order to make a literal Genesis jive with modern science. And so a lot of it was my story too, coming from a young earth creationist perspective. Baby Dinosaurs just looks at the evidence for evolution, looks at the problems of creationism in all of its iterations, including intelligent design creationism, age of the earth, that kind of thing. It's basically a primer. I found that what most people who reject evolution know about evolution comes from anti-evolution resources. And so I wrote Baby Dinosaurs to be an examination of the evidence from someone who was a person of faith, hopefully establishing some trust there.
Right.
And on the topic of outrageous arguments for the flood, the animals on the ark, and mental gymnastics, I do remember coming across a comment on a Facebook thread, and I forgot where it came from, but a question was posed to the group in this Facebook group. The question was, what did lions and other carnivores eat while they were on Noah's Ark for 40 days? And they bantered back and forth, tried to explain how this might happen. And one person said, remember that our bodies can go for a long time with little to no food, plus the waters were rough. Few even feel like eating, the whole seasickness thing, so they didn't need to eat.
For a year.
Yeah, and let's not forget, this person is writing, let's not forget God provides. Remember the bread and fish? Let's not get caught up in logic when we walk by faith. So that's the kind of level of science that we're talking about.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard at least that the Creation Science Museum, or whatever it's called, actually has Adam playing with dinosaurs or something along those lines. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I have a shelf which one of my dear friends has entitled Janet's Shelf of Nonsense, because I get gifted a lot of children's books showing dinosaurs happily scampering with humans. And I'm not sure if they are always intended as jokes or to straighten me out. But regardless, I have a shelf of Janet's baby dinosaur books.
Wow.
Okay.
So, yeah, the central problem seems to be that evangelicalism has become fairly anti-science, and not just anti-science, but anti-intellectual, really. And in that kind of move, they have also embraced, in many cases, pseudoscience. And again, COVID, I think, was a good example of that. There was a lot of pseudoscience out there, and people were pretty quick to embrace that and very skeptical when it came to kind of valid science, which is kind of interesting, because skepticism, that's a good thing. Skepticism is healthy. We need to question our assumptions and things like that. They seem to express that skepticism, but only with the things that seem more validly scientific, and not very skeptical when it comes to kind of outlandish claims like we've just been discussing. There was a book a number of years ago, a very well-known book in evangelical circles. I believe it won Christianity Today's Book of the year it came out, called Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Noll. And that's a great book. And I did mark a turning point, and I do think this needs to be said, that in my Christian experience, I'm 64 years old. I first made a commitment of faith when I was like 16, so I've been around a little while. And in my kind of my own journey, I have definitely seen a significant ramping up on the intellectual side within certain parts of the evangelical movement. And as we've kind of mentioned before in this podcast, what I find frustrating is that doesn't tend to filter down to the pulpits and the churches. They're still back in the 40s, and yet there is an intellectual front in evangelicalism that's actually quite respectable. And there are many now evangelical scholars who do embrace evolution and so on, but it's not becoming popular. Maybe Janet can talk a little bit about that, why that might be, but. Yeah, there's definitely this tendency. And I think the other thing, just to mention quickly, is that evangelicalism grows out of a few important movements historically. One of them is Lutheran pietism. And pietism emphasizes the heart, what the emotional side of religion. And so I, in my own experience, have had a lot of people say to me, "Oh, you're all head, Scott. You're too heady. You're too nerdy." Just like that comment, Luke. Just believe. That doesn't work for me. And for people that it works, great. I have no issue with that, but it doesn't work for me. And I don't think it works actually for a lot of people, but those people, we just kind of cut out. We just don't care about those people. They're just kind of condemned, and we don't make much effort to try to reach that particular group that thinking and working through is more important. And so I think that head versus heart thing is also a strong trend historically.
Yeah. When we talk about science and faith at war with each other, inevitably the Galileo incident is brought up. But actually, it was important and interesting, but the Galileo incident did not have nearly the shockwaves that the Scopes trial in the 1920s had throughout the Christian world in general. Yeah. And, and the more I thought about it, I thought, why the 1920s? Darwin's work had been published for decades. Why, decades later, did it become this issue that gripped the country at the time? Well, there was another factor that came into play about the time that Darwin was writing and publishing. In the 19th century, there were also theologians, I think primarily coming out of Germany. I think it's popularly called historical biblical criticism. And these theologians were beginning to look at the Bible with ancient eyes. And so you have this perfect storm of Darwin and biblical criticism coming in at the same time. And so in the early 20th century, we began to see, in the days before internet, it took a while before it got out of academia, which was where Darwin was and where historical biblical criticism was, until the early 1900s, 1920s, when we see it spilling into the pulpits and into the church picnics, where not only did we have these godless scientists telling us that we came from monkeys, but now we had these academics in their ivory towers telling us that the Bible was not the actual dictated words directly from God. And so you have these two things coming together in a perfect storm, becoming a part of the public evangelical Christianity in general consciousness. And so it all came to a head in Dayton, Tennessee, with the what is called the Scopes monkey trial. And it's been called the trial of the century. It's at minimum the science trial of the century. But it's important to note that in the Scopes trial, no scientist testified at all, and no science evidence at all was entered into the record. Instead, you had a couple of attorneys that were very popular orators. William Jennings Bryan, the victorious prosecuting attorney, probably if he were alive today, would have a radio talk show or a cable talk show. He was known as the Great Commoner. So Bryan did not argue against evolution using science evidence. Bryant spoke the language of the people, and his talking points, I see them summarized down to three. Bryant said there's no evidence for evolution, and even scientists don't believe it. Bryant characterized those who support evolution as being enemies of the Bible. And finally, and this is a big one, Bryant said that because those who reject evolution are in the majority, their rights as citizens are being violated when it is taught in public schools. And so, today, decades later, after the Scopes trial, Bryant's outline is unmistakable. It's like there are argument fossils that we can dig up in arguments against other areas of modern science. And so for decades, before COVID, before climate science was anywhere on our radar, we see generations, Christians, particularly those with evangelical leanings or in evangelical precincts, being told that the science evidence for evolution is sketchy, misrepresented, or just wrong. We have been told for decades that science threatens faith. And we've been told for decades that the acceptance of science evidence comes at a cost to your personal rights. And so then we are faced with COVID, we're faced with climate crises, and we use the same talking points.
Wow.
We have been trained to reject expertise, despite what you say, some highly intellectual evangelicals, highly educated evangelicals, but we have been trained, we have been conditioned for decades to approach science with this same list of arguments, so to speak, that Brian initially used against evolution.
Wow. So what I'm hearing is that right from the outset, right from the beginning, if you look at Scopes as being that kind of pivotal moment, it's kind of been a culture war as much as a science war.
Absolutely. And interestingly, the evolution of the Scopes trial morphed, evolved, so to speak. And in the 1970s, 1980s, with the publication of the Genesis Flood book, we see the birth of the modern young earth creationist movement. And it's that version of creationism that the United States has been so good about exporting to parts of Europe and Australia and Canada. You're very welcome. But interestingly, the tact that was taken in the 70s and 80s with this new version of young earth creationism, initially, it was proposed that creationism was a science. And the first organizations made to promote creation science pushed it as a scientific alternative that should be taught in public schools, that it wasn't just a religious concept, but it was actually a science. Well, surprisingly not, it didn't take long before the advocates of creation science found that they could not prove evolution to be wrong. And so not too long after creation science was launched as a field of study, they changed directions. And instead of creation science being evidence that can be found in nature, the change in directions became evolution is the source of everything wrong about our culture. It's the source of all evil. Evolution became the cause of abortion. Evolution became the cause of homosexuality. Evolution was the cause of school shootings. Even disobedient children were thrown into the mix. And so when you make fighting evolution part of your culture war, it's a lot easier to blame evolution for the societal ills than it is to prove evolution to be false.
So if I can just stop for a moment and just say that what we're talking about here isn't just a cultural movement that's about anti-science, it's anti-intellectualism. And the anti-science part is really easy to identify. I mean, we're talking about COVID and about evolution, but let's talk for a few moments about this anti-intellectualism that's in the evangelical demographic. And one of the things I think that Mark Noll is referring to when he talks about the scandal of the evangelical mind, the people are not just against science, they're also highly likely to avoid reading and learning about philosophy. They just don't want to get into the philosophies. They'll avoid anything that has strong ties to other world religions, which would include yoga and meditation and statues from Aztec or Hindu temples. They just don't want to have anything to do with this. They have a knee-jerk reaction against art. It was just a few weeks ago, actually a couple months ago, that Scott and I did a series of episodes on evangelicals and sex. And we began off with the story of evangelicals not wanting their elementary school kids to see because it's pornographic in their eyes. We talked to Frankie Schaefer about the evangelical tendency to avoid art in all its forms, not just visual art, but literature and music. So, Janet, I'm just curious if you have anything to say. What's behind this lack of curiosity and this closed-mindedness?
I think it definitely goes back to when science became a front in our culture wars. When we couldn't disprove evolution, we made it the source of all evils. And so when a pandemic strikes, we don't address germ theory, we don't address the way science works, but we make it a front in the culture war. So in a pandemic, if they can shut down our churches and they can make us wear masks, and if they can force us to take a vaccine instead of trusting in the blood of Jesus to be our vaccine, what's next? Are they going to make us bake cakes for gay people? It became a slippery slope to the next cultural evil that was on the evangelical radar. And, the same with climate science. It's no longer do we address the actual evidence, but climate science becomes a fight for our gas stoves or our ceiling fans or our big trucks, even our very American way of life. And I think a lot of that, again, can be traced back to that perfect storm of that the evangelicals were facing at the beginning of the 20th century. And so as a reaction to that, evangelicals began to silo ourselves off. We couldn't send our potential pastors and theologians to these godless secular universities by any means. We couldn't send them to formerly religious schools like a Harvard or a Princeton. And so we had to create our own seminaries, our own Bible colleges. And we did all of this separated from the university, which is not what theological education had been in the past. And it's still not really the European model of it. Historically, theological education took place within the context of a university. So you had your theologians and your pastors exposed to faculty in the arts. You had your theologians exposed to faculty in philosophy. And so there was this cross-pollination, so to speak, where the professors teaching theology, teaching the future theologians and future pastors were working and researching alongside those who were researching and working in the arts. But we siloed ourselves off because we could not send our students, especially our potential pastors, into these godless universities where someone might tell them they came from monkeys or that the Bible should be read with ancient eyes. And so we created this vast, vast network of education where a person can go from Mother's Day out to a doctoral degree and never leave an evangelical institution and never be exposed to anything other than an evangelical approach to philosophy, to art. And I think that is what the outcome of that is when we see you can't talk about the David statue because it's pornography. Because we have no background to say otherwise.
And just in case the listeners didn't connect the dots the way you did there, Janet, you talked a lot about universities being set up to keep the potential pastors from going to the godless universities. But it goes earlier than that. The evangelical community set up their own high schools, their own grade schools. A lot of them just opted for homeschooling. So they completely separated their kids, their teens, their young people, and their potential pastors from anything outside of their little bubble.
Right. And still today, if you go on to any of the big young earth creationists, there's a big one in Dallas. And we all know about Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis. There's Institute for Creation Research here in Dallas. And they will advise parents to even be wary of Christian colleges, Christian schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. And the ideal is to homeschool, further isolating from any other kind of information, any kind of a view outside a strictly evangelical worldview.
Boy, these are great thoughts, and I'm so glad you brought these items up, Janet. You kind of read my mind, because as we were talking, I was thinking about, I need to bring up the revolution that really happened in the 1910s, 20s with the modernist versus fundamentalist kind of movement. And the Scopes trial is emblematic of that. Maybe even it's the pinnacle of it, but it's a lot broader than that. Within denominations in the US and Canada and really all over the world, there was this eruption happening, right, where the higher criticism from the German theologians was coming in and so on. And that's when for example, the biggest Protestant denomination in Canada is the United Church of Canada. And that came about because the Presbyterians and Methodists and Congregationalists all left those groups because they felt they were not progressive, and they formed the United Church. It was born out of that. And many other denominations were kind of birthed during that split between fundamentalism and modernism. And once that happened, if you're embattled, what do? You build a fortress, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's exactly what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And they built their own schools. I remember as a young believer, I was told many times, don't even think about going to university. You'll lose your faith. Mm-hmm. Now that should have twigged in my mind something. I should have thought, well, why? But at the time, it didn't. I bought into that because I remember, interesting, my father at the time, who's not a evangelical Christian, he was willing to send me to university and fund it, but not if I went to a Bible school. And that, to me at the time, just further ingrained, this my poor lost father doesn't want me, this kind of attitude. Now I look back on it and I think, you idiots, you could have gotten a university education for, on your dad. But it just showed that mentality was very, very prevalent. And I think it's maybe true to a lesser extent now than it used to be, but I think it's still pretty strong out there, cloister.
Right. Yeah. And my siloing was even stricter than that, because the particular branch of evangelicalism that I was raised in was not ecumenical in the least. Maybe some pros and cons with that, but it was not. And so, I had the choice. I could stay and go to the state university at home, or my parents would pay for a university amongst our denominations. So, even then I picked the most academically rigorous and most progressive at the time university to go to. But yeah, we do lots of siloing ourselves off. And again, I mentioned this, I think just a few minutes ago, is that we quite often do not address things that we disagree with, positions we disagree with, from the perspective of the position holders themselves. We read what's wrong about that position, and we think we've educated ourselves on a position. And evangelicalism has become such a huge bubble. We have our own publishing houses. We have our own Bible colleges. We have our own universities. And as you mentioned, all the way down to elementary schools. There's no reason to ever get outside that bubble. An author can become quite successful only publishing with evangelical houses and only selling to evangelical readers with no problem at all.
Yeah. Yeah, then the music industry. I mean, you could be pretty successful in the music industry too.
Right.
And then if you broaden out just a little bit, get in on that gospel kind of Nashville thing, the sky's the limit. So now, is it becoming a little more difficult given modern technologies such as the internet and so on? Is it harder to fence off people than it used to be because they can go online and find out information? And do you think that's more difficult today, or is it still pretty much the same?
Well, it depends. If you limit yourself to evangelical adjacent websites, the information is out there, but still, what is it? 40% of the population of the United States will identify as evangelicals. And interestingly, and I wrote a bit about this in The God of Monkey Science, is there is a modern phenomenon of people who don't particularly attend religious services anywhere and don't particularly identify as a member of any church, yet they will self-identify as evangelical.
Yeah.
And so you have this almost culturally or politically evangelical demographic.
Yeah, it's kind of maybe call it a nominal evangelicalism, right. I worked a fair bit years ago in Tennessee, and I really noticed that just everybody's a Christian down there. Everybody's a born again Christian. In Canada, that is not the case. They're a fairly rare bird still in this country.
Right.
But down there, I worked for a big insurance company. They had Bible studies in the cafeteria, and so on. It was quite shocking to me. I thought, wow, this is really, right. And it helped me understand a little bit, because sitting in Canada and listening to the press, because the press does tends to, except for Fox, it does tend to have a left bias. And I remember thinking, I kind of see where they're coming from now. I see why they have that bias, because there is a real culture war going on at the grassroots level that they're kind of trying to, I guess, counteract or whatever. It was, very interesting.
Well, and I think also when you said, with the internet, does that expose people more? Well, one thing, again, that we have trained ourselves to do because we fought evolution for so long was to approach science with foregone conclusions. We have been trained that is a legitimate approach to science. Just a couple of weeks ago, I saw this on social media. You will find evidence for a global flood if you just look for it. And so not only within the evangelical community, but as a science educator, I definitely think in just our population at large, there is a dearth of understanding about what it means to do science, that scientists do not approach research with foregone conclusions. In fact, scientists will approach research in order to prove themselves wrong. You don't prove your hypothesis, you fail to reject your hypothesis.
Right.
But we haven't done that. We have approached science with foregone conclusions. And so we approach our research on the internet trying to find evidence that back ourselves up, that back up the positions that we already have. And I think you guys mentioned earlier, the idea about pseudoscience and why that is so pervasive, especially in some of the evangelical precincts. And I think that also can be set at the feet of a lack of science literacy. Pseudoscience gives us certainty. You drink this supplement and you will get your migraines cured, or your diabetes will go away. Or if you take ivermectin, you will not get COVID. Science never speaks in terms of certainty. Science speaks of whatever the best evidence it is at the time. So when at the beginning of COVID, when we weren't sure if there were asymptomatic spreaders, we weren't sure about masking, but it didn't take too many weeks later before we had the evidence in that there were. But to the general population, this looked like flip-flopping.
Right.
And the scientists were speaking out of both sides of their mouth, which fed into an evangelical narrative of scientists are all in on it. Scientists can't be trusted. There is no evidence for what they're saying. Therefore, let's listen to these other people who are telling us something that feeds our preconceived notion.
Yeah,
Right.
and I kind of get that in the sense that even popularly amongst not religious people, but just generally, we're told cholesterol is the enemy. Don't eat eggs. Don't eat, and then all of a sudden, nope, eggs are awesome. And, and so, I get it. Like, I get why people are, but you're right. Like, that's kind of how science works. We are going to change our mind. We are going to discover new things. Thank goodness that's the whole,
Right.
But if people are not taught that, then they take the wrong, even a guy like Bill Maher, a liberal of liberals, I've heard him on his show a number of times denigrate science on that basis because, they told us this and now this, Well, no, yes, they told it because that was the best evidence we had at that moment. But
right.
As we learned, we shifted, and that's what's great about it.
Well, one of the, in my opinion, one of the biggest one of the largest areas of damage done by denying science for so long and for denigrating scientists and the trustworthiness of science and scientists is that we can no longer discriminate between who is an authority and who is an expert. And so we see particularly in the COVID pandemic, all sorts of people presented themselves with the trappings of authority. We had everyone from the president of the United States to politicians, to television pundits, to a group of doctors who put on white coats and stood on the steps of the Supreme Court with all the trappings of authority. But yet none of them were speaking with expertise in the field, or at the very least, the expertise of the consensus of the field to which they are speaking. So I think that is a huge problem that has come from decades of science denial, is that we don't understand the difference between someone who is speaking as an expert and someone who is simply speaking as an authority. And that's why during COVID, we saw pastors, we saw politicians, all who were all of a sudden experts or authorities in public health and putting a vaccine exemption documents on their church websites and speaking to things like this, speaking as authorities, but not speaking as experts. And we were trained, we were conditioned to accept that because we saw that for decades in fighting evolution. A very well-made documentary is Genesis History. Is a young earth creationist documentary and has all sorts of people speaking on the documentary with lots of letters behind their names. And so they're all speaking as authorities, but you dig a little bit deeper and they're not either authorities in the field in which they have their letters and degrees, or they are speaking outside the consensus of a field.
Yeah.
And to tie this back to what the past several episodes we've been doing on intelligent design, we had several people portraying themselves as experts. They have PhDs. Michael Behe, Jonathan McClatchy, Stephen Meyer, they all have their PhDs, but not in the areas in which they're speaking. And then we did talk to other people who actually do work with the flagellum or with cell biology, with genetics. And those people told a different story. So
it's all about approaching your research with foregone conclusions.
Right.
And I think, No,
I'm just going to say, Janet, that research has come up a couple of times, and one thing that I heard a lot during the pandemic, and I bought into this myself. Do your research. Okay, but do you know how to do research? Most people don't. And B, I can do my research on biology. Let's say we're talking about, a new drug or whatever. I can do my quote research, but I'm an idiot. I'm a lay person. How do I know whether this research is really, I can't do research like Luke can do research because he's a trained microbiologist. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So people, I think, were thinking, well, I've developed this expertise. I've gone on all these websites and read all these people. So I did the research. Well, mm-hmm. I think we have to be really, really careful about that, because if it's not your field, you can be, misled very easily, because you don't really know. You don't have the training to sniff out whether, this is valid or not.
If I can take this in a different direction, but making the same point, people not having the proper training to apply the information that they're using, let's talk about how one of the strategies that a lot of the anti-science, the evangelical anti-science people will do their work is to misquote scripture. Applying, cherry-picked Bible verses. And I'm not talking about simply insist on a young earth creationist view of creation and human origins or Noah's flood. I mean complete distortion and misrepresentation of cherry-picked verses to support an outrageous claim. We've all heard, for example, how people have linked the COVID vaccine to the mark of the beast. Mm-hmm. Janet, you had even crazier examples in your book, the claim that the vaccine alters the genome so that people who get the vaccine, now they're transhuman and therefore no longer sons and daughters of Adam, and there goes salvation out the window. The one that I hadn't heard before, but Janet, you made a mention of this as well, people claiming that Genesis 8:22 is a clear evidence against global warming because God promised to Noah. He said, and this is God speaking in Genesis 8, as long as the earth endures, which is a long time, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So therefore, global warming is never going to happen. And another thing that I know I was guilty of back in the day when I was in that evangelical world, all those passages about the end times and how God's just going to burn it all up anyway. So who really cares what happens to the world? Who cares if it gets polluted? I remember thinking that, this can't matter because Jesus is coming in 1984, right? So,
well, maybe the promise to Noah is very correct. In other words, the earth will only endure while seed time and harvest, but the fact is we're ruining seed time, so the earth's not going to endure. Right. Maybe that's more true than we think. Anyway,
there are entire graduate degrees devoted to an area of apologetics called concordism, right. Where we are determined to make the Bible speak to science and vice versa. Just a couple of weeks ago, someone sent me an internet meme and asked for my comments on it. I didn't know this person. I think it came in on my author page, but it was one of those memes that had two columns. And on one column was supposedly all of these incorrect scientific beliefs of the ancient world, and then on the accompanying column was what the Bible said that was accurate science, even though the Bible was written at the same time of these ancient beliefs. And so therefore we prove God. We prove God. Because we found it in the Bible when nobody else believed it, but the Bible said it, therefore God wrote the Bible, and we have somehow proven God. It didn't take me very long looking through that chart when it said the ancient people, thought the earth was flat. I'm like, no, they didn't. The librarian at Alexandria measured the circumference of the earth, before the birth of Christ. And so the knowledge of some of these things was known in ancient times. And again, what we don't see on these charts are all the areas of science that the Bible speaks to that are just honestly incorrect, that are wrong. And so I found that it's frustrating to me. And I use the term mental gymnastics a lot when we feel like we have to make the Bible fit our preconceived notions of what the Bible teaches. And it became freeing to me, honestly, that there is nothing that science could discover that's going to make me not believe in God. You could find evidence for abiogenesis. You could find evidence for the multiverse. And that isn't what is going to make me not believe in God. I don't look to science to give me proof of God.
Right.
And I think we definitely fall down that rabbit hole. And when we approach Scripture, again, with our preconceived notions that we're going to find science in there or else all is lost, we might as well give up on God. If we cannot find and make a concordance between science and Scripture, all is lost, give it up now.
Yeah.
And, honestly, that is one of the issues that I have with the intelligent design version of creationism, because you're approaching evidence looking for design.
Right.
Yeah.
You're approaching evidence looking for design. And so you are not working as science truly works, where you're looking for what is there, not what you think should be there.
Right.
Yeah, it's really reintroducing teleology back into science. And one of the great discoveries of the Enlightenment and the foundation of science is really, in a lot of ways, is taking teleology out of science, saying that we just have to look at nature raw, and discover what it is, and to start attributing things to purpose and movements like vitalism, well, there must be some vital force. So that was a very popular view back in the 18th century and so on. But over time, science has shed that philosophy and just tries to look at what is the evidence, where is the evidence taking us, where, and then as to the worldview that comes, see, I think that I'd like to ask you this. So there is on the other side, I'll just play devil's advocate for a second. If you look at people like Richard Dawkins, these horsemen of the apocalypse, they call them, or the new atheists, whatever, Sam Harris and Dennett and Dawkins and so on, particularly Richard Dawkins. I mean, he has come out quite boldly and said, if evolution, no God. Now, that's pretty much to me the same as saying if design, then God. I mean, what's the difference between those two things? And is that problematic from that side of it?
In my opinion, there is absolutely no difference between those two positions.
Yeah.
I teach at a large state university, so I don't know the religious leanings of the students that I've had over the years. And so as a biology professor, I make it a definitive point to mention evolution all the way through my curriculum in my intro biology classes. I just use the terminology. But at the end of the semester, I tie it all together and I hit evolution hard. And I always begin by saying there are people on both ends of the spectrum that will tell you that you cannot be a person of science and a person of faith. Both of them are wrong. And so I'm limited to what I can say, but I try to be as definitive as I can be. And I'll say, because I am a person of faith and I completely accept the evidence for evolution.
Right.
And so, we go for the next couple of weeks, we look at evidence. And then for many semesters, on the last day of the semester, I would have them respond on a note card. And I would ask them a question about evolution, just kind of a big picture thing, how evolution works. And I have a small collection of students who were brave enough to push back because their grades aren't in at the time. And they will just blast me with scripture, everything. They don't believe what I say. They believe what the Bible says. They believe God. And the first time that happened, and I read those cards, I had this overwhelming feeling of, honestly, embarrassment, because I thought, it's me. I'm that atheistic professor that their pastor and their parents warned them about.
Yeah.
And I am here to destroy their faith. And so since that first happened, I try to be even more specific as I can to say that, what science tells us, what your faith tells you are two different things.
Yeah.
And answering different questions. And those who tell you you cannot accept science and be a person of faith, they're speaking with the same, they're speaking the same words, and they're both wrong.
Yeah. So have you had experience with this being helpful to students, like students who maybe come into the class having been raised in a young earth creationist kind of thing, and now their worldview is expanding, and that can be a very traumatic process for people. So
yeah, interestingly, a couple of times when I had majors intro biology, it was all positive because these were students who already had a scientific bent. I noticed one of them came in one day with Collins's The Language of God book, along with his textbooks. So that opened a conversation. I had another student who was actually raised in a communist country where he said he was specifically told that religion is bad and evil, and converted to Christianity once he moved to the United States. And so we've had a lot of good discussions there. But the pushback that I get invariably is from my non-majors. And I changed my approach just last spring semester. Instead of asking them a question about evolution on the last day of class, I told them to ask me anything they wanted to know about evolution, and I would answer them back privately. And that's the way I'm going in the future, because I got lots of good questions that way. And I felt like I could be much more open in a private, email to them about, how I reconciled being a person of faith and being a person of science.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So Janet, we've got two worldviews here. We're talking about a group of people who are very anti-science, anti-intellectual. And then, of course, the opposite, the ones who embrace science. And some would say, okay, why don't we just live and let live? If they're happy and I'm happy, let's just get along, learn to get along. But I think it's fair to say that there are some actual costs of growing up in that anti-science community. Let's talk briefly about that. I want to first talk about the kids who grew up in that anti-science bubble. I think there's some opportunity costs that they're going to face. And so I'll pose this as a question then, Janet. Maybe you have data on this. Are they less likely to aspire to professional careers, like being a scientist or a doctor, for example? Or does growing up in that kind of an anti-science bubble make it harder for them to pursue other careers that require higher education? If they were homeschooled, meaning when I refer to homeschool, I'm getting at the idea that I think sometimes it's a subpar science education. And or if they got secondary and post-secondary education at institutions that didn't ground them in courses like evolutionary biology, and so they're going to struggle when they go to university. Are those opportunity costs real?
Absolutely. In God of Monkey Science, I talk about a climate scientist who was raised evangelical, and her thought was, they won't want me in this field. They won't want me. Not that it was incorrect or false, but that she felt like she would not be welcomed as a person of faith in the field of climate science.
Right.
There are examples of biology, geology faculty at Christian universities that separate their professional life from their religious life. And they just lay low, try to fly under the radar about their religion. And they just speak to the science when it's time for science, and they speak to religion when it's time for religion. But as far as across the board, this is just an aside and just my anecdotal experience, because my husband is a medical doctor, but some of the staunchest young earth creationists that I've ever met have been very brilliant medical doctors.
Oh.
Yeah. And, my husband will say it's because our education is all about medicine. There's so much we have to learn. We don't talk about the theoretical aspects of it. Now, again, we went to school at a Christian university before they overtly taught evolution. I'm thrilled to say that my alma mater, just a few years after the whole debacle with the professors, came out and said, no, we are a university. We are a research university. We're not going to be intellectually dishonest. And so I'm happy to say, actually, my alma mater brought me in 2 years ago to speak about the anti-evolution book in chapel, of all places. And so, there are some universities that are stepping out like that, but they're also losing some student body because there are lists out there, if you want to find them, of which Christian universities teach evolution as fact. Yeah. And you're warned away from them. So, there is depending on what Christian university you are teaching at, there is definitely a professional price to be paid. And I think that, definitely with our potential scientists, if they're coming up in a strongly anti-science environment, they're going to think twice before they enter that field.
Yeah. And so in addition to those educational and professional costs, I think we also can say that there are health risks with holding this anti-science view. I mean, denied access to certain medicines or procedures, avoiding vaccinations and transfusions are two obvious examples here. But we could also talk about a lot of medical help for mental health issues that are otherwise just dismissed as, demonic attack.
Right.
Or not getting properly prepared for the strangeness of sex and even for marriage because of a very restricted and sheltered upbringing. Certain groups who just would shun Western medicine and rely on folk remedies, that sort of thing, that have no scientific basis. And I think another health risk, is there's a lot of emotional costs. The emotional costs of believing that the authorities, the government, and even your doctors are tools of an antichrist system. The ostracization in high school of being a Christian in a non-Christian world. And a lot of the cognitive dissonance. I know that I had a lot of struggles with all the cognitive dissonance. You had to, as you said, Janet, you had to have one half of your brain in the science world and the other half of your brain in the faith world, and you had to keep bouncing back and forth between those two halves. So there's a lot of, some of those, maybe it's a stretch to call them health risks, the cognitive dissonance, but there are health risks, mental and biological.
Yeah.
Right. And I would absolutely say, I think there are risk and there are casualties of faith in evolution denial.
Right.
But with the pandemic and denial, it became life-threatening. And in longer terms, climate science became, it also brings in a life-threatening situation as a result of science denial. I hate to say it, but, how long was the COVID pandemic prolonged? Because this 40% of our demographic in our country said that the epidemiologists and the scientists were all in on it, and they were bureaucrats and they shouldn't be believed. And the COVID vaccine is experimental and it hasn't been around long enough. How long? How many more people got sick? How many more people died because this huge demographic of evangelical Christians were in denial about the science of COVID? And so, research tells us that it's not accepting science that's shipwrecking faith, but research tells us that it's the church's antagonism toward science that is shipwrecking faith. And so now we're seeing that there is fallout beyond faith, that there is an actual health risk to this huge demographic being so negative towards science and how science works and denigrating scientists and the actual character of scientists themselves. And so, unfortunately, there is a very real price to be paid and was paid during the COVID pandemic.
Just going to ask, this is maybe more of a question for your husband, but you were talking, just going back to the medical thing, that a lot of Christians go into medicine, and that's not near as much of an issue as going into biological research and so on. Is that partly because now I'm just saying, this is the question really, but does evolution have much impact on medical practice? In other words, can I be just as good a doctor whether I believe in evolution or not? I assume I probably can be, right? Like, even if I don't believe in evolution, I can still be a good doctor. It doesn't require me, does it? Or am I wrong about that, do you think?
I think you can, because like I said, some of the most brilliant doctors, medical doctors that I know, because it's chalked up to look at the amazing design of the human body. How did this ever just get here by chance? And so that's the verbiage that you hear. That's the story that's told. Now, can you be a really good epidemiologist or infectious disease doc if you do not accept the evolutionary information against pathogens? I don't know. That might be a question there.
Well, Luke, I'm curious, Luke, in your field, you spent your life in research and working with many other researchers. How much of a factor was evolution in that? In other words, the actual work you did, how significant a factor was your understanding of evolution actually in that work?
Well, certainly nothing that I did in my research itself was asking an evolutionary question. It just didn't. I did learn to hold evolution as part of my framework, my worldview. I didn't initially. The first 10 or 20 years of my life, or let's say the first 10 years of my research life, I was still very much an evangelical and under a lot of cognitive dissonance trying to hold that together. But I'm an N of one, as we would say in science. It's just an anecdotal account, and mine didn't really relate to evolution.
Well, I guess this is something that's always kind of intrigued me, and this sounds like I'm arguing for the other side, and I'm not. But I think it's just a question. But what's intrigued me is, other than evolutionary science, in other words, trying to demonstrate, prove evolution or demonstrate evolution or whatever. Other than that, how important is the idea of evolution in the other science? In other words, is it something that's critical to us doing good science in other areas? You know what I'm saying?
It's absolutely critical in many other areas. I was just saying, again, with the N of one, in my case, it wasn't, but many, sure, that would be the case.
So you couldn't do your research properly if you didn't agree with the evolutionary kind of framework or whatever. Maybe Janet, you could also address that in your...
Yeah, I love this question.
Okay.
I think it's a much bigger picture than those of us who are in science education, bench scientist. I think it's a much bigger picture. I recently read a book and actually heard the author being interviewed on a podcast. He wrote an amazing book about evolutionary science. I have no idea if he's a person of faith or what his background is. But one of the things he addresses was just quite discouraging. It was kind of depressing to me, to be honest. He was saying that when he finds someone who pushes back against evolutionary science, he doesn't engage. He doesn't try to convince them. He'll give information, but he doesn't pursue a conversation. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe I'm just stubborn, but I'm not ready to give up that easily. But it made me understand this broader picture that no matter what field we find ourselves in, if we across the board deny evolution science, pandemic science, if we find ourselves with a worldview that we are skeptical of science and deny empirically demonstrable evidence, we've completely taken ourselves out of the broader conversation. I tell my students, regardless of whether they're going to be science majors or not, they are still going to be our voters. They're going to be our teachers. They're going to be our pastors, our politicians. And you need to have a degree of literacy when it comes to science. So when we find ourselves in these pockets of science denial, we've completely taken ourselves out of any broader conversation. Who's going to listen to us? I'm not going to listen to a flat earther tell me about the best approaches to combat climate change. I'm just not.
Yeah.
By having that degree of science denial, in my estimation, they've taken themselves out of a broader conversation. I'm probably not going to even trust them to do my taxes, but I'm certainly not going to take what they say in a science field seriously.
Yeah.
So with science denial, particularly a religious-based science denial, we just admit that we have nothing to say. We may think that we're sticking up for God, but what we're actually doing is just making ourselves irrelevant to the broader conversation.
Right. Okay.
And so in the end, I think the answer here, I was thinking, what is the problem? The problem is that the anti-science, anti-intellectual nature of the people we're talking about. And I guess the answer is more science education, more open conversation. And Janet, you've taken that one step further with your 2 books. Maybe, is there any closing comments that you want to make, something that we hadn't gotten into or something you'd like to say before we wrap this one up?
Well, I can just say, like I said, I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet. And I think that people of faith can speak to science, that people of faith have something to say to science, more than just denying the evidence that there. What does this look like? It might look like this, okay? Evolution is a fact. Humans share common ancestry with all life. All right, given that fact, how do we rise above an animal natural nature to put ourselves first? How do we, as creatures tied to all life on this planet, how do we then represent God to the rest of creation as image bearers? Could we say, if another pandemic strikes, can we as people of faith say, all right, germ theory is real. And we know that churches are going to be facing a lot of problems. So what do we do when a deadly pandemic is shutting down public assemblies and we still don't know how we should approach a novel infection? What should our response be while we are trying to figure all of this out?
Right.
Science may change, but how, as people of faith, should we respond? Should we use our offering money to pay attorneys to keep our buildings open? Or should we use that money to help those who can't work from home or who live in multi-generational homes? Can we have honest discussions about climate science? Are we prioritizing our own interest? Or are we rejecting the science because we are rejecting the solutions? There are all sorts of things that people of faith have to say to science if we would just speak to the science instead of outright denying the science.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And what will your 3rd book look like?
Oh, it's already living in my head. But don't. I made the mistake of telling my editor that before Baby Dinosaurs completely came out, and the next thing I know, I had a deadline in my inbox. So, the 3rd book that's way back in the back of my head here is I want to look specifically at human evolution and what that has to say about being the image of God.
Right. Excellent. And Janet, we wish you all the best as you develop book number 3 and more as you release book number 2 in October. Scott and I have both read the book, and we do highly recommend it. It's a great book. It's an easy read. It's not an intellectual, not a high end, read even for anti-intellectual people. So we wish you all the best on both books that are, well, the one that's out and the one that's coming out, and then the third one that's going to come out.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.